Yes, my daughter did just lose her allowance this month. And I'll try not to be too boring. All right. So when I was looking at this scripture for today, and biggest idea of Jesus and who Jesus was eating with, there was actually an experience from when I was probably about Vivian's age, actually, that came to mind. And it was the experience of being in the lunchroom at my elementary school in eastern Montana. Now, we actually had a very, very old school, so it didn't actually have an actual cafeteria space in it. So we would usually just eat in the art room. They would serve us in the hallway, and then we'd go and we'd eat in the art room. And of course, in those days, there was a lot of expectation that kids would be quiet and respectful while they ate, and all this sorts of stuff. And we had people that would monitor and make sure, and if you got out of line, they'd let you know. And if you got too out of line, or were just being a little too rambunctious or a little too loud, they would make you move. And you'd have to take your stuff and you'd have to go to a table that was up front, kind of almost on this little riser thing right here. And it was called the monkey table. And you did not want to be sent to the monkey table. But you always knew, and of course there's always those a few kids in class and some of your peers or whatever that you just knew, a couple of times a week, they were going to end up at the monkey table, right? Now, what was fascinating looking back on it now is that's what we kids called it. It's also what the adults called it, and I kind of hope we don't do things like that anymore. And I do remember the handful of times, very, very small number of times that I was made to move and go. And of course you just feel, you feel different, you feel ashamed, and that was probably the intention of the whole thing in the first place, was that you would feel bad in an attempt to not, hopefully you would do better next time. So I was remembering this experience as I was thinking about this, because I think we all, have those people we like to sit next to, the people we like to hang out with, the people who we enjoy sharing our pew with, and probably also have those people we would rather not. Right? And we all have it, and it's just kind of human nature. There are certain people we were comfortable with, certain people we were uncomfortable with. And that is just how it is, and that's how it is today, and it's honestly how it was 2,000 years ago as well. And much like you didn't want to be seated at the monkey table at my elementary school, 2,000 years ago in Jesus' time, there were people that you would not share a table with if your intention was to be a good, upstanding, and respectful person. Which is what is obviously happening here in this story. Now, here we get introduced actually to a character. We're getting introduced to this person named Levi. As is often the case in the Bible, if somebody's given a name, we know they're important, right? And that's one of the little signals that the authors use to say this is an important person because we're giving him a name. Now, what's interesting is Levi appears here and then doesn't appear again. Later in chapter 3, when there's a listing of who the 12 disciples are, Levi is not included. So he's only here at this front part of the story, and all that we know about Levi is that he's a tax collector. We know what he does for a living. Now, if you were a tax collector in that time, it doesn't mean that you also weren't Jewish. It didn't mean that you weren't necessarily, part of the Israelites. In fact, many people who were Israelites basically took jobs from the Romans because the Romans paid well. And being a tax collector was a good paying job. Now, what it also meant, though, is that you had to interact with people who were not of your same group. You had to handle money. You usually had to work on the Sabbath. And all of these other rules that everyone else was trying to live by, if you worked as a tax collector, you couldn't do them. And this is what actually landed you at that time in the category of sinner. When the Bible talks about, especially in the Gospels, talks about sinners, what it is talking about is people, because of either by choice or vocation or whatever, aren't able to do things in the proper way, the way that everybody else is doing them. And because of that, they are usually considered outside of the community. They're considered unclean. They're considered unrighteous. And if you want to be a righteous person, you cannot hang out with unrighteous sinner-type people, because I guess it's sort of like cooties, and it will rub off. It's a little hard for us today to oftentimes put ourselves in the mindset because we don't live by those same kind of draconian standards as they did, but this was a really, really big deal. So the fact that, if you notice also, we're only in chapter 2 in Mark. Not much has happened yet. Jesus has showed up on the scene. He's recruited a couple of disciples. He's healed some people, and he's taught some people. But that's about it. So this is actually the first time in Mark's gospel that Jesus is interacting and eating with people, and he's choosing to do it not with the respectable folks, but with the sinners. And what's interesting, too, is, as we've talked about before, translators have to make decisions. And in the NRSV and most translations, it will say Jesus sat to eat with them. That's actually probably not the best translation of the actual Greek word. The best translation would actually be reclined. Because at this time, they actually had these eating couches, right, where you would lay on this eating couch, and it would they didn't know this was what's happening, but really what's happening is they were like properly aligning their digestion so they could eat more. This is a Roman tradition, and it was popular at the time, especially against more well-to-do people who actually had a lot to eat. So not only is he, we may have this idea of Jesus kind of like sitting at this formal table or something like that. That's actually not what was likely happening because the gospel writer chose to use the word reclined. It was probably more of a scene like this where people are literally like laying around and food is coming to them. And so it's understandable why the Pharisees sort of take exception to what's going on here. Now, the other thing that's happening here is the introduction of the Pharisees in Mark's gospel. Before now, we haven't heard or seen of them, and so this is the introduction of the antagonist. And of course, the Pharisees will antagonize Jesus throughout his time and throughout his ministry. Now, the important thing to know about the Pharisees is the Pharisees actually believed in a lot of the same things that Jesus did. So when they believed in life after death, they believed in, they had a lot of similar ideas. And in fact, some of the things that Jesus was trying to teach, you can find in the Pharisees' writings of the time as well. But the Pharisees don't like Jesus because it's probably like one of those nobody fights like cousins, kind of thing. But the Pharisees take exception to what Jesus is doing because not so much about what exactly he is saying at this moment, but it's who he's saying it to. Because on one hand, we have Jesus who's eating with sinners, and on the other hand, we have the Pharisees who are actually trying to make the world more strict. They're actually attempting to take some of the restrictions that are only practiced in the temple, and they're trying to bring those restrictions into everyday life for everybody else. And of course, this works out really well for them, because if there are hundreds rules you have to follow, and they're the only ones who know all the rules, then obviously they're the ones that have the power. It's like playing a game with a 4-year-old who's making up the rules as you go. You can't win, right? We've all been there. And so that's the situation the Pharisees are trying to set up. And of course, they're really interested in being the righteous, in being the good people. So when Jesus shows up and he's done some interesting things and he's starting to get a following and he's healed some people, and as people start to talk about him, they get curious, like, oh, who's this guy over here? And then they find him not eating with the right people, but eating with who in their minds are the wrong people. And he's doing it right from the very beginning. What Jesus is doing here in the second chapter of Mark is really building from the very foundation important things about what it's going to mean later to follow Jesus. He's setting basically the spirit of the movement. And in today's kind of modern world, we might talk about the fact that he's embedding a very certain DNA right into the church. And the one thing that we all know, again, in our modern world, is our DNA sort of is our DNA. It is not something that can be or easily is changed, right? And so Jesus wants to set the DNA of the movement straight from the beginning, and he does it by doing some very unexpected things, including this moment where he's eating at the table with the wrong people. Because right from the beginning, he wants people to know that this thing that he is doing isn't just for some people. The thing that he is doing is for every person. And he does it not by first courting the righteous and the respectable folks, but he does it by first going to the ones others would consider unrighteous and unacceptable. And the Pharisees, of course, have a huge problem with this because it's kind of the opposite of what they're trying to do. But of course, we now know, 2,000 years later, that we have a seat at the table because there was a seat at the table for the sinners 2,000 years ago. Now, I have a really, really great example for this, but unfortunately, it strays into kind of like PG-13 territory, and I didn't warn you I was going to do that. So I'm actually going to put that example in the podcast. Now you're going to listen, and yes. Anyway, that's going to be in the podcast. It's going to be great, but I won't. Yeah, sorry. I have preached it before, but I warned people ahead of time, and I'm not going to do it today. So, which is really unfair of me, and I know. So the question then becomes, and we should know this, and so this idea of DNA, this idea of what is in the foundation of who you are, what is the foundation of what you believe, is important for each one of us, but it's also important for groups, right? Groups and communities take on a DNA, they take on a culture, they take on some kind of foundational ideas of who they are and what's important to them, and oftentimes those things that get kind of embedded at that deep level are hard then to overcome later on. And so what you want to do, and especially if you're building a group or you're part of a group, you want to make sure that that group or that community you're part of has good DNA at the base, that it's built around and cares about the right things. And as someone who spent my job before I was here working with all kinds of different kinds of churches, I can tell you there are faith communities that have really good DNA and there are faith communities that quite frankly don't. And it doesn't usually take too long to figure out which is which. And there's some phrases that will come up relatively quickly if you're in a church that's kind of has some maybe not so great or really sort of stuck DNA. You'll hear a lot of things like, we've never done it that way before. Right? That's not how we do it here, right? It doesn't matter if the way we do it works. Doesn't matter if it's it's actually having the results we want to make. Is that kind of stuff. By the way, I don't think I've ever heard that out of anybody here. Or if I had, I forgot it. You said it to me, and I tuned it out, and I ignored you. So one of those two things happened. But that is not something that I would say is part of our culture. And I think it's one of the reasons why, as a community here at our church, we have been able to navigate the last year and a half as well as we could, because we were already kind of had we already had some flexibility to us before. At least that's how I've experienced you. And if that's not true, don't ruin my delusion. I don't want to know the truth. But so recently, but I have some hints that that's the way that it is. And one of the hints I got recently was we've had some amazing office volunteers here cleaning out, and one of them has been Betty has been cleaning out the office and finding all these amazing little treasures, and of course sharing them with me. And one of the things that she shared with me recently was actually the little booklet that came out on October 25th, 1998, and it was our 25-year anniversary of being in this building. So somebody went together, 25 years, or 1998, what would that have been? 22 years ago? Yeah. Put together this nice little booklet. It had some stuff about the history, things that I didn't know, and I really liked that. And I got to one section I wanted to share with you. So this, if you don't know, our church today is actually the product of two churches coming together in 1968. There used to be two churches in town. The buildings are still on Charlotte. But this church is a product of those two churches coming together to make one new church. At the same time, the two denominations were coming together to form a new denomination, the United Brethren and the Methodist Episcopal Church coming together to make the United Methodist Church that we know today. Our church was actually, I'm claiming it, was the first church to do that this side of the Mississippi. So we are the product of that merger. And coming together can be interesting because sometimes they invite opportunities to think about new things. And I love this quote when it talks about the merger. The merged church used the Methodist pastor of the EUB building. Some of the blending was not hospitable. There were some hard feelings when some committees merged and relieved their counterparts of their duties. None of the offending members are part of the congregation today. Quote, and I am very glad. I don't think the quote's credited, but I'd love to know. I am glad too. Now, it's not that we should be in the business of, turning people out by any means. That's not the way that it is. But there is, when groups of people get together, there is a certain thing we have to decide, which is how are we going to live with one another? How are we going to work together? How are we going to be who we are, even though we come here from a diversity of places and a diversity of backgrounds? The Pharisees' goal was to do that by actually making sure there weren't diversity. That was their goal. They wanted to make sure that if everybody acted the same, did the same, ate the same, did the same things at the same time, then it would be, in their minds, easy to maintain community because we were all doing the same thing. Jesus shows up on the scene and blows all of that up by not going to the good people, but by going to those who are being left out, to go to those who are being excluded, to go with those. Now, he doesn't necessarily, and this is the important thing, it is not that when Jesus met with some of these folks, it's not that he was necessarily condoning everything they did. That was not the case by any means. But what he is doing is saying that the need to include people, the need to make sure that that the grace and the forgiveness and the love that we all know from God is available to everybody, that's the most important thing. So when Jesus makes this big, wide table and invites everybody to do it, he's not saying everybody at this table is perfect and nobody at this table is doing anything wrong, far from it. But what he's saying is that if the love is going to be known, if the grace is going to be known, if the transformations that need to happen in individuals' lives are going to happen, they first have to be at the table. They can't know the good news, they can't know the grace, they can't know the love if they're not at the place where the grace and the love is being explained. John Wesley, who I talk about all the time, and you know this, built this into the Methodist movement as well. John Wesley was famous for preaching in fields because the ideas he had about who should be in, which is basically everybody, were considered so radical that nobody would let them preach in his churches. In fact, he had a rule that if he did preach in a church, it had to have a back door so he could run away. He wouldn't preach here. Because it was not uncommon for people to throw things at him. If you read his journals, it's hilarious because it'd be like, the journal entry will literally be, I preached in so-and-so's field today until they turned the bull loose on us and I had to run away. And what crazy idea was he doing? What crazy thing was he proclaiming? He was proclaiming this idea that God's love, grace, and the church should be open to all. And that everybody should have a seat at God's table. And that everybody should have the opportunity to learn and hear the good news. And church wasn't just for the good people and the respectable people with the nice clothes. Church was supposed to be and intended to be by Jesus for everybody. That is something that he baked into the DNA of the Methodist movement. And when the Methodist movement is at its best, it's when we remember that. And when the Methodist movement is at its worst, it's when we don't. The simple truth is this. If Jesus had come to my elementary school in eastern Montana at lunchtime, he would have sat at the monkey table. Not because he would have been made to, but because that's where he would have wanted to be. And I often wonder now what it would have meant then if somebody had voluntarily gone there to be with those kids. None of us did, because we all bought the idea at that time that there were good kids and there were bad kids. And the bad kids were at that table. If Jesus had entered that room, he would have gone to that table to tell us there aren't good kids and bad kids. There are God's kids. And we are all God's kids. Yes, we may screw up from time to time. We may do things we're not supposed to do. We may do things that are bad for us or bad for our neighbors. We may get angry. We may get mad. We may get sad. Those things will happen. But it does not mean that we are relegated to the other side of the community. It does not mean we are suddenly on the outs. What it means, as Jesus said, I did not come for the righteous, I did not come for the well, I came for the sick. What it means is when we're in those moments, when we are not our best, those are the moments when Jesus tries to enter our lives even a little bit more, to remind us who we are and what's important about us. And what's important about us is not where we eat and who we eat with. What's important about us is who we are, what is baked into us, what is in our DNA that we cannot change. We don't get to change that we are God's beloved children made in God's image. That is a fact, and that is whether you want to believe it or whether you feel like it or not, it is true. That's who we are at the core of who we are. And it's also true that we are able to make decisions, which means we're able to make mistakes, and we will. And we'll screw up, and we'll do the wrong thing. And when we do, Jesus will sit at our table and make sure we know that love is still there, grace is still there, forgiveness is still there, and hope is still there. And so because of that, there is room at the table, room at God's table for everybody. And what we do in response is simple. Our call is simple, to make sure there is room at our table for anybody God puts into our lives as well. Amen.